Well, hello, everybody. We are continuing in our series on the fundamentals of U.S. regulatory affairs. Today, we are going to skip around a little bit. Our next chapter, we're going to take two chapters today. They're both short chapters, rather than moving into the device chapter, which we will set for the next lecture, the device regulation. But today, we're going to talk about two topics: pharmacovigilance, which is in Chapter 6 in the book, and combination products, which is in Chapter 8. So these will be two little half lectures because they're short chapters, and the fundamentals, either of them could, of course, deserve their own whole lecture, but for an overview survey course, I think it's better that we focus on just half of this time and for each of those topics. So let's start off with pharmacovigilance. Vigilance, to be vigilant, okay? Surveillance, to be looking for cases, looking for things that are out there, adverse events in this case is what we're talking about with regards to pharmacovigilance. The focus is on drug adverse events, bad things that happen to people when they take drugs, and they do. The FDA does not actually have a formal definition for pharmacovigilance. And yet it has become the term of art for a lot of the post-marketing activities. A lot of the focus is on what's called signal detection, trying to find events that might mean that maybe this drug is associated with adverse events. They have, historically, many of them have been found through pharmacovigilance, just listening and watching and trying to learn from manufacturers and astute clinicians especially what kinds of adverse events are happening from these drugs. So for example, one of the good examples that's put in your text is fenformin was found to be, quote, an imminent hazard to health. There are all kinds of things that you never would expect that are just picked up through these systems like MedWatch that we'll talk about shortly. The acceptance of risk on the part of the American people is decreasing with increased media coverage of adverse events. Some of them have been very high-flying, very notable examples in which drugs are marketed to millions of people and bad things start to show up. And the public has a lower and lower tolerance over the past few decades for such events. It has been said by Margaret Hamburg that the FDA only knows how to approve drugs at two speeds, too fast and too slow. And this is the example of too fast, where prior to knowing all of the safety outcomes of a particular product, things are moved into market. So the assessment of safety continues well after market, and drug pharmacovigilance is now part of the regulatory life cycle. So when a drug comes into common use, its post-approval use is orders of magnitude higher than the clinical trials. I mean, even for a drug that's for a common disease, clinical trials might get up to 3,000, 5,000 people in which it was tested. But when it goes out to the market, it may be 1 million, 10 million, 20 million people taking this drug. So a lot of subsets of patients aren't known. What about patients who are taking other drugs? And all of those possible combinations couldn't possibly have been addressed in the context of a clinical trial. Likewise, all of the possible genetic diversity hasn't been addressed in a small clinical trial. What happens about comorbidities, subsets of populations who have other diseases at the same time as the disease that this drug is supposed to be treating? How will that all be affected? So you can see that after, the clinical trials tell you something, they tell you a fair bit about what the safety profile is, but you really don't know until it gets out into the marketplace and then bad stuff happens. And bad stuff happens all the time. So some of the big publicity adverse events were Vioxx and Avandia. People were brought before Congress, and Congress recognized the importance of pharmacovigilance. In FDA 2007, it set up, there's been increased product litigation right now. big, huge lawsuits, class action suits. Lawyers find opportunities to make tremendous amounts of money. So CMS has also issued new regulations to help gather more information from Medicare Part D, and that's come out forward. So Congress is trying to act to catch up a little bit with this phenomenon of how to deal with adverse events that happen after products get out into the marketplace. But it all begins with an astute clinician, somebody in Kansas or somebody in Tampa or somewhere who notices that this patient was given this pill and this bad thing happened, and maybe the two are related, and reports it in to the manufacturer or to the FDA. But most reports, as you'll hear, actually come from manufacturers, so it's industry's responsibility to do so. So supplemental applications are required to add or strengthen on 30-day pre-implementation FDA review and approval. There are two principles of pharmacovigilance. One is timeliness and the second is accuracy. So there is a clock that's set up for what you have to respond to and when you have to report those adverse events into the FDA. There are some voluntary elements. The people who are actually doing the reporting, the clinicians, that's totally voluntary on their part. Okay? But the manufacturers, anybody who's on the label, that's mandatory on their part. And there are fines, and if they don't report in anything that they know on a proper time scale, then they are culpable, and actions can be taken against the sponsors, the manufacturers, the distributors, anybody who is on the label attached to the drug. It's mandatory for them to report in, but the actual reporting source, the point of care, it's not mandatory on their part. It's actually totally voluntary on their part. And that's one of the great weaknesses of the system as it has been existing right now. I will not be going over, there are some new initiatives that FDA has, such as Sentinel, that will be more active. Surveillance systems in general, and this one in particular, are graded as either active or passive, depending upon how much energy goes into the collection of new cases, in this case is adverse events. Most of the systems that are established right now would be considered passive reporting systems. Sentinel, which has come in recently within the last few years and is still being developed based upon databases of healthcare providers, HMOs and others that have been collected together. United Healthcare is one of the large contributors of a lot of this data that can be mined and seen for adverse events. That's a little bit more of an active kind of surveillance system. But at this time, and for the past several decades, most pharmacovigilance data that has been most useful has come in through passive reporting. Astute clinicians pick something up, report it in maybe to the drug manufacturer. The drug manufacturer is then required to report it into the FDA. FDA receives thousands and thousands of these reports every year. I mean, tens of thousands of reports every year. And as you know, the agency is limited in its personnel resources. So they have come up with means by which to try to analyze these and get some wheat out of the chaff of all of this influx of data. It is not by any means a perfect system. When I dealt with it myself, and CBER, the Center for Biologics Evaluation Research, as a branch chief there for pharmacovigilance, it was some of the dirtiest data I have ever dealt with in my life. And at the same time, it was highly productive, rich. I think over the few years that I was there, we published at least a dozen papers on various kinds of adverse events that were reported in through this means of astute clinicians. So, what is an adverse event? An adverse drug event is defined as an event associated with drug use. So, as I said, this is circular. It just means they took the drug and this thing happened. Okay, and it could be anything that this thing happened. It does not imply causality, and the FDA explicitly wants you to report in things that you don't even think might be caused. That the net is cast wide. Now, naturally, they're going to have to interpret that to try to figure out whether it was causal or not, because that's the objective. But for the initial report, the net is cast wide. Um, so it includes intentional and unintentional overdosage, for example, drug abuse, drug withdrawal, or a failure of the drug to have an effect. So you give somebody something, you think that it's supposed to do something, it doesn't do it. Well, that's an adverse drug event too, okay? It didn't work. You would want to know that it didn't work as well. So there are other definitions that are included in your text. Disability is a substantial disruption in the ability to conduct functions of normal life, life-threatening, and so anything that causes death is life-threatening, results in birth defects, results in disability. These are called serious, okay, events. And so a serious adverse event is one that fits into one of those categories. And everything that doesn't fit into one of those categories is not a serious adverse event. Pretty straightforward. So there's two fundamental principles on how we categorize adverse events. The first is the seriousness, serious or not serious. The second is the expectedness. Is it expected? Is it already known? Or is it not known? And what is the rubric for this? The label. Okay. So the label is this interesting document you should know. It has a fundamental legal role. It says that the manufacturer is communicating to the public what the adverse drug events are that are known. It has an important role in whether the sponsor is liable for adverse events that occur, because if they're already on the label, then you're not liable for it. And if any of you have read these labels, they go on and on about every possible conceivable adverse event that has ever been reported through these pharmacovigilance systems. Even if they occur 1 in 10,000 times, you can't really, number one, the data isn't available for knowing exactly the frequency of a lot of these adverse events because they're sporadic, spontaneous reports. It makes for a document which has a very limited value in the communication of risk to either the patient or to the physician, but has a maximum value in mitigating risk to the sponsor. So that is not necessarily a good thing. I don't think that anybody, even at the FDA or in industry, would say that this is the best way to communicate risk, but it is the way that we categorize adverse events as expected or not expected, and this combination of expected and seriousness is how we know on what time schedule things must be reported by those who are required to report, namely the manufacturers, or not. And so 15-day alert reports are serious and unexpected. Something happens and it's not on the label, and you find out about it as a manufacturer, you got 15 days to report this thing in, okay, to your district office or to the FDA. And who has to report this? Well, basically anybody whose name is on the label, the manufacturer, the packer, the distributor. Now, this can cause some trouble in that there can be duplications that occur from time to time when several people are all reporting in. And the requirements didn't really envision the fragmentation that the pharmaceutical industry has experienced as it has gone forward. Information from the scientific literature as well requires pharmacovigilance. So manufacturers are required to regularly peruse the scientific literature on everything that is published on their drug and report any adverse events that are published in the medical literature back into the FDA, and they have to include a copy of whatever it was that was published. So this is a big deal. It takes a lot of energy and time and resources on the part of pharmaceutical companies, and as I said, it's voluntary for the providers to report in the adverse event, but it's mandatory for the manufacturers, anybody who has a vested interest in this. So 15-day follow-up reports are the reports which are submitted on FDA Form 3500A that are a comprehensive follow-up investigation of that initial 15-day report. Okay? The maintenance of these records is incredibly important. So when you have a serious adverse, if unexpected adverse event, you have to do an investigation. You have to figure out all the particulars around the details. Now, this form is basically one huge open blank field for the most part. Now, there's some particulars that are categorized as gender and the age of the patient and a little bit about comorbidities and other drugs and so on. But most of the information is found in one block. Here's the story, okay? A written story. And that has advantages in that it is very open-ended and allows the reporter to report a great many details. It's difficult in that it's not really computerized, and to try to suss out and figure out the exact nature of what's going on can be, through a computerized analysis when you're flooded with thousands and thousands of reports, it's not easy. Periodic adverse event experience reports are in the first 3 years after approval, sponsors have to submit quarterly reports of all adverse events that don't fall into the 15-day report. So those are serious expected, serious, not serious expected, not serious unexpected reports. Those other three combinations. They have to be reported quarterly within 30 days of the quarter's end, and annually, there's an annual report within 60 days of the NDA or ANDA's approval. Post-marketing studies and the scientific literature reports are exempt from the periodic adverse event report, so there's a little difference there as well. These are some things that you actually do need to know, okay, because this is one of the entry-level jobs in regulatory affairs, is dealing with these reporting requirements for adverse events. Privacy requirements, privacy requires not including patients' names or their addresses, okay? So you don't include that, but you can create a unique ID, and the submission of a report does not imply causality. And the regs explicitly note this, that when a sponsor is reporting to the FDA, he or she does not impute that this is a causal event and can't be held culpable just on the basis of these adverse events, because again, the FDA wants as many of these adverse event reports as possible. It's burdensome, it's challenging, but at least they have the data from which to start when things go south. Okay, so concomitant medications are to be included, and it's a very open-ended form. The analysis principle. So how does the FDA try to figure out whether or not this drug caused that adverse event? Somebody drops dead, okay? Well, how do you know that they got this drug and that's what caused them to drop dead? Well, a couple of things. First of all, there's a time frame picture. They look at when was the drug administered and when did this adverse event occur. Knowing something about the pharmacokinetics of the disease might help you to say this could be causal or this couldn't be causal. One of the best ways, if you have the data, is if there happens to be a challenge, de-challenge, re-challenge. So they took the drug, they broke out into hives. They stopped the drug, the hives stopped. They took the drug again, the hives started. Well, pretty close, okay? I mean, that strengthens your argument. So de-challenge, re-challenge are important ways. But there aren't really any agreed criteria for what's causal and what's not, what kinds of evidence satisfy it. Some people have tried to make categories as probable, improbable, likely. There is also this notion of confounding by indication that you should know about. So a patient takes a drug that was for treating a certain disease and has an adverse event which is related to the progression of their disease but is not related to their drug. Okay? So you should know that that is a common occurrence, is that there will be a large number of adverse events reports that deal not with the drug but with the underlying disease as an adverse sequelae and temporally they're associated, but it is a sequelae of the underlying disease. NDA Field Alerts are when you're really ringing the alarm bell. They are applicable to approved products only. There is a 3-day time limit. This is the shortest time limit of all. You've got to get it in right away. And they are the most critical filings. They generally concern manufacturing problems or an imminent threat to public health. Like if you had a product that's sterile, it's supposed to be sterile, and it gets not sterile, it gets contaminated. You got to report that within 3 days, probably less, probably within like 3 minutes you got to report it in. But the legal requirement is 3 days. Most of these things involve current good manufacturing practice issues. You have to notify the district office. That's what they do. This also applies to misbranding or adulteration issues, any physical or chemical change. Annual reports are a big deal that have to go in within 60 days of the NDA date. I mentioned them earlier. They're a summary of all the effectiveness and labeling information that has gone on with the product for your annual NDA report. Advertising and promotional materials are also the subject of reporting. There is distribution data to be reported, and so how many lots have you sold? That also has to be reported in. Any epidemiologic studies, any kind of clinical trials that you have that are ongoing, everything that you know about the drug and your marketing and your experience with it has to be reported in with the annual NDA report. So as I mentioned, the big deal is the safety signal. It's noted in FDA. FDA expects company to be looking for signals. So that's vigilance, watch, be a sentry. And if things are found, then there's always consideration with the agency of changing the label, of adding yet another thing into the adverse event section of the label. Supplemental applications is a time when you might also want to incorporate pharmacovigilance data. Generic drugs have the same, you do need to know that generic drugs have the same responsibilities for pharmacovigilance activities, compilations, and reporting as the innovator drug. So this is an area in which meticulousness and attention to detail is requisite and held in very high regard. Okay, so there's your primer on pharmacovigilance. Let us turn now to Chapter 8, combination products, and we will come back and hit Chapter 7 in the next lecture. Lecture 8. Chapter 7 is in Lecture 8. Okay. So, combination, what is a combination product? Well, it's not when you have two drugs in the same pill. A combination product is when you have two different kinds of products somehow combined, somehow connected to one another. So, there are only a few possibilities. You could have a drug and a device, combination product. You could have a biologic and a device. You could have a drug and a biologic, or you could have a drug, biologic, and a device. Okay, so there's 4 possibilities for combination products. And we are getting more and more and more of these submitted and approved under the current technology as it's moving. So 2 of the same kind do not a combination product make. Okay, so 2 biologics or 2 drugs or 2 devices that are connected, they are not a combination product. These are increasing in numbers. The Safe Medical Devices Act of 1990 was the first to deal with this, and the concept which is preeminent in deciding how these products are regulated is, quote, the primary mode of action, and that's the term that guides which center is going to do the review, which center is going to follow up with the pharmacovigilance, which center is going to handle the regulation under which law. So there are a few different ways in which products, combination products, can have been combined. One is that maybe the product is physically or chemically bound together. An example might be drug-coating stents. Okay, stents that go inside of arteries to keep the arteries clear and open. It's been found that these stents work even better if you coat them with some sort of an anticoagulant drug that will promote anticoagulation. Or implantable replacement joints that are coated with growth factor. Okay, spurs on the business of healing and repair, and seems to be worked very well. Or a monoclonal antibody, which is then attached to a therapeutic drug. So you get some real toxic chemotherapeutic, but you want to direct it at particular cells, so you attach it to a particular kind of monoclonal, and the monoclonal then targets it in on the cancer cells. That's how it works. So you've got a drug and a biologic connected together. So those are some examples. Another way that products can be put together is how they are co-packaged. So if you have a drug that it comes in the form of a kit with a specific applicator of that drug, well, that's a combination product as well. Or drugs that are packaged separately but intended only for use together, perhaps through stipulation in the label. The leading center reviews the products under their own enabling regulation. So the primary mechanism of action can be difficult to define. Intercenter agreements between CBER, CDRH, and CDER specify in some degree how these things are going to be handled. These intercenter agreements were established back in the 1990s, and it has been decided that they're really becoming dated at this point. We've decided that the CDER, CDRH, and CBER CDRH intercenter agreements still appear to be very useful. They serve as guidances, and it's been declared by the agency that those guidances should still be looked for in combination products that involve devices. But the CBER, CDER guidances have pretty much been left behind in the wake of history. The primary mechanism of action is defined as the means by which the product achieves an intended therapeutic effect or action. Okay, so what's the primary way that this thing works? And the drug-eluting stents, I think, are probably our best example. It's a single mode of action that's most important to the effect. So the drug-eluting stents, it has been decided that their primary means of keeping the artery open is mechanical. That the drug that elutes on it is sort of like frosting on the cake, so to speak. That the primary mechanism of action is the device. So they are regulated as devices. Now, it's not listed in your book, but you need to know that when you have a combination product that involves a device, most sponsors want to have their product categorized as a device, and we'll talk in a moment about the means by which you request a determination as to a request for designation, excuse me, as a device or as a drug. It is seen to be a clearer, easier regulatory path to achieve your way to market as a device than as a drug. So for the stents, for example, people are pretty happy. In contrast, a drug-eluting disc for the treatment of brain cancer, for example, and there are a few. You put in these little discs and you leave them in place in the brain, and they perfuse out a certain drug and slow down the progression of the cancer. Well, there, the disc itself is seen to be incidental, and it certainly works as a repository and as a depot, but it's the drug. So those are classified. Their primary mechanism of action is the drug, and so they are regulated, as in reviewed for marketing approval and safety and efficacy and adverse events and all those things by CDER. Okay? But there is always a lot of cross-pollination within the agency. So if it is a combination product, you can fully expect that the center that is regulating it will have contact with the center that is not the primary center in the drugs regulation. So a sponsor comes forward and says, hey, I got this combination product. It's part device and part biologic. Who is going to be it? Well, you have to go to the Office of Combination Products, and the head of that office was a friend of mine when I was in the Office of the Commissioner, and he will determine, according to existing rubrics, which category it fits into and which center is responsible for it. And he has a regular standard operating procedure by which he and his staff do that. Combination products do have to do post-marketing reporting, and drugs and biologics are fairly close in their post-marketing reporting requirements. But the post-marketing reporting requirements for devices, as we'll see in the next chapter when we discuss it, are substantially different from drugs and biologics. And they have different reporting periods and so on. You should know that in the manufacturing side, there are different rules for drugs and biologics versus devices. So drugs and biologics are generally reviewed by good manufacturing practices, and those are stated in regulations. And devices are often, the manufacture of devices is regulated by quality systems regulations, or QSRs. So this brings up even more confusion. Which set of rules do we need to follow? Generally speaking, people want you to follow both at the same time, but not to have to establish two separate processes. That makes no sense at all. With regards to the application, another question that comes in is, well, I've got a combination product. It's a device and a drug. How many applications do I need to submit? FDA can require more than one application for combination products. The primary mechanism of action doesn't necessarily determine whether your application type is going to be a NDA, a BLA, or a PMA. And they can decide which application type it's going to be. Usually there's only one application for a combination product, but sometimes there can be two. And if there are two, it brings up the question of how many user fees do you have to pay? Do you have to pay a PDUFA and a MADUFA, or can you just pay for one? Well, there is a mechanism for getting a waiver of having to pay specifically, there's a, quote, innovative combination product waiver, and one should apply for that. Especially if there are two NDAs, say, that are required, they can cut that down so that you pay half on each, and then you pay only one fee. So, this is up to $1.8 million right now, so it's not insubstantial. So, as I mentioned, the Office of Combination Products is the place where what it is it going to be regulated as a drug, as a device, as a biologic, gets decided there. Okay, very good. Well, we have concluded. This concludes our review of those two topics, chapters 6 and chapters 8 in the book on pharmacovigilance, combination products together. Next time, in lecture 8, lecture 8, we will review the issue of the regulation of devices. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.